We're going to get started with our third and final panel of the day at the Moritz Sports Symposium. This is a special group we've got together. Again, as we've done with the first two panels, take the issues of the year in sports law, sports business, sports policy, sports thought, and unfortunately, in this circumstance, sports scandal, and talk about them, and with the leading voices that will do so. This panel is about Me Too in sports, and we'll focus on an uncomfortable issue that happened to many, including someone who's up here. The moderators for this panel will not be me. Erin Schmidt is from Morgan Lewis and works on Me Too issues there as part of a group that does that. And we're happy to have you, Erin. Professor Ann Juliano, anyone associated with Villanova Law knows Professor Juliano, the great work that she does here. Also involved not only in employment law, but in Me Too issues. And I know she's thrilled that we're dealing with this issue, and I'm happy to have her. On our panel, Terry Boyce. Boyce. We have Boyce and Boyer. Terry Boyer runs the McNulty Institute here at Villanova for women's leadership. John Manley has been involved with legal action on behalf of many gymnasts. I'll let you speak to it, against the USOC and USA Gymnastics, involved in those litigations right now. On the far left, a colleague of mine from ESPN, someone I admire as a friend and a colleague, John Barr, who we're lucky to have live in this area, so his travel expenses are light. John, for anyone who watches the preeminent show, I think, on ESPN, Outside the Lines, he's a fixture there with his investigative journalism, someone that has delved into issues that may be uncomfortable and has brought light to darkness. We're so thankful to have John in media and have John here. And our special guest today is Larissa Boyce. Larissa was abused by Larry Nassar and was in court speaking about that with so many women that confronted him in January. Those images were all over national news. Those images are seared in our memory, and we are so fortunate to have Larissa share the stage with us today. Let's welcome our panel.
I want to start by taking a moment to thank Bridget, the editor-in-chief of the Sports Journal, and Emily, who's the symposium editor for this great symposium that we're having today, and Jeff and Andrew for putting it together. I was very happy to have a Me Too panel in the symposium today as we talk about social movements and sports. Me Too, I think, is sort of the third phase of dealing with sexual wrongs, harassment, or crimes. The first phase, maybe in the 70s, was giving this a name and recognizing that it's a wrong. The next phase was getting the courts to accept it as claims, and I think Me Too is about accountability. It's about finally having accountability for what's been going on. And we had a great student event a few weeks ago that some of our groups put together talking about Me Too, and it was at that event that I realized you can't say Me Too until someone said me. Someone has to be the person to come forward and say me. And what's so powerful about our panel today is we have that person who came forward and said me. So our panelists are going to talk a little bit about their experience with this movement and thinking about accountability. And I've asked Larissa as a strong voice for accountability to start.
Thank you. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my story. First of all, I am a proud mother of 4 children, And so I'm the CEO of my household, and that is not an easy thing. It's very hard to keep 4 children and a dog alive every day. But I do it, and it's actually very rewarding. I am an alumni of MSU. I got my bachelor's degree there, and I think that I'm still coming to terms with the fact that I was sexually abused as a child. My abuser was trusted and loved by everybody. He was revered in the Olympic world, in the gymnastics world. He basically had a godlike status. So when my coach, Kathy Klages, recommended that I go to him when I had a back injury, that's what I did. He was the best in the world. Why would I question that? And sadly, most people think that pedophiles are the scary stranger that lurks in the dark, but it's usually the person that you trust the most. And it's the person who's friendly. It's the person who is volunteering for everything and always immersing themselves among children more than around adults or peers. And I think that's something that people need to educate themselves on. So back in 1997, I tried to tell MSU's head coach, Kathy Klages, that Larry Nassar was making me feel very uncomfortable with his treatments. I gave her the specifics about what he was doing, and instead of supporting me, she humiliated me and embarrassed me. She brought in all my other teammates while I was sitting in her office, and in front of me, asked them if they ever felt uncomfortable with what Larry Nassar was doing. All of them, except one other girl, said no, so the other girl stayed in the office with me. And Kathy then still couldn't believe that her friend, she said her friend for years and years, her friend would never do anything that was inappropriate, that we must be misunderstanding what was going on. And then she had us talk to some of the college students. It was like she was trying to investigate. And first of all, as a child, it is not easy to stand up and talk about sexual abuse and say that you think something is happening to you. So, and I looked up to Kathy. I wanted to be a college gymnast. I wanted to compete at MSU. So that pressure that she was putting on me and this other girl was devastating. She truly silenced me that night at gymnastics. So instead of trusting my instincts, I had to convince myself that I was the problem, that I had a dirty mind, and something must be wrong with me. But the betrayal got even worse when I learned that Kathy had told Larry Nassar that I went to her with my concerns. He confronted me at my next appointment. I, of course, was mortified, and I actually apologized to him for a misunderstanding, and I told him it was all my fault and that I was so sorry. And to prove that I was not somebody who had a dirty mind, I hopped back up on that treatment table, and he continued to abuse me for the next 4 years. So I first came forward in 1997. The adults I trusted did not believe me. I was conditioned and brainwashed into believing that I was the problem. For 20 years, I truly believed that. It was not until my lawyers told me that they would take my case after hearing Rachel Den Hollander's story. It wasn't until they said that they believed me that I allowed myself to start believing what had happened also. And I just thought maybe, just maybe, I was right all those years ago. And the possibility grew even more over time as I allowed myself to look deep at the memories of the different situations that I had been abused. And, I have to forgive myself for not pursuing it further when I was a child, because hundreds of girls could have been spared had Kathy done the right thing that night and reported. And so that's hard to comprehend. A lot of the girls weren't even born yet, and they were abused because an adult did not do the right thing. I also think that this whole movement that happened during the Nassar sentencing, that would have never happened had the Assistant Attorney General Angie Popolitis or Andrea Mumford or Judge Aquilina or Judge Cunningham, if they didn't allow us to give our statements, I don't think what you guys saw happen would have happened. I think that once Kyle Stevens got up and spoke first, it just started a snowball effect, and women started having the confidence to shed their anonymity, and it was an amazing thing to watch. And I think that people need to realize that as a lawyer, you have the power to help your clients, to tell them that you believe them, and that they're worth being fought for. And, you know, unfortunately, we can't turn back time, but we can learn from those experiences. We've witnessed a monumental change in history with the Me Too movement, with the Larry Nassar case, and everybody having the courage to speak up and say, this happened to me. And like you said, if one person doesn't do it, who's gonna do it? I always thought, you know, if I don't speak up, who will? Which is why I'm still speaking now. Another thing I think that is interesting is, why did it take 156 women making impact statements for the world to start paying attention? That's another thing that is very disturbing, and, you know, I wonder, is it because we're girls? Because we're women? I don't know, but finally the world is listening and things are changing. You know, I think that telling your story, telling my story, has helped in the healing process, and the more people speak up, the more this is not a taboo subject. So I think that's all I have right now.
John, do you want to?
Good morning, I'm John Manley. I'm a lawyer from California. Thank you. For the last 2 years, my practice is exclusively representing children who are sexually abused and adults who have been sexually abused as children, and some sexual assault cases. For the last 2 years, all I've done is this case. Actually, I'm not Larissa's lawyer because she's relatively intelligent and didn't hire me. But there are now almost 300 women who have stories very similar to this. And in thinking about this and speaking to, you know, law students and lawyers, I want to talk about the value of our civil justice system in the context of the Me Too movement. And really, the genesis of this movement in terms of law was really the Priest cases. That's the cases in '97 I started doing, and it really developed, you know, the law in this area and allowed these cases to be filed. You know, when I was doing, I probably did, well, I've done thousands of cases against dioceses and religious orders, not the Augustinians, because I suppose that's the only reason I'm here. But I got the Jesuits pretty good. The notion that this was a problem outside of institutional religion in 2002, if you said that to me, I wouldn't have believed you. But what we now know is that child sexual abuse in sports, in public schools, is epidemic. And ladies and gentlemen, if you think this is a Michigan State and a USA Gymnastics problem alone, you are very wrong. It is a problem here, it is a problem where I went to school, it is a problem everywhere. And the reason for that is cultural and deep, but it needs to change. And it may seem odd for a plaintiff lawyer to tell their client, which is what we do, your first goal here should be healing. I tell clients that come into our office, if your goal is money, you're making a terrible mistake. Your goal should be getting better, and all of the other will follow. And what I can tell you is that not in every case, but in most cases, this process of civil justice for these victims, women, men, boys, and girls, is healing. Not always, but most of the time. And if it wasn't, I don't think most lawyers could do it, because the horror that these kids faced, the horror that she faced, and the courage it takes to stand up in the face of these institutions is incalculable. To stand up to Marta Karolyi and the U.S. Olympic movement and say, you know, you did this to me, and the crushing weight of the power that institutions like Michigan State have to just viciously crush a victim's spirit and soul, it's like walking into the face of a firing cannon. And I can tell you that Larissa will never meet the little girl she saved, but they exist. Those other women who stood up and gave speeches, many of whom were anonymous and on the spot decided to use their names, will never meet the children they've saved, but they exist. So often, we hear in our debates about, fraudulent lawsuits and, tort reform and business environment. And, we all know there's lawyers who file nonsensical lawsuits. But I hope when we discuss that, people remember these cases, because as good as the criminal justice system was in Michigan that allowed these women to have their voice, I can count on two hands the amount of the thousands of cases we've handled that have actually been prosecuted and somebody went to jail. The way most survivors are treated is, it's not victim-centric, it's criminal-centric. And part of that's the nature of the system, but it's not good. So frequently the only out or the only place victims can go is to a lawyer. And so I would just encourage you to continue to follow this case and follow the many other cases that are cropping up in independent schools and public schools, and watch this issue. Because when a child's sexually abused, it has ripple effects throughout the entire society. If you go to jails and you do statistically accurate surveys, you're going to find that the vast majority of male inmates have a history of sexual abuse. Many female inmates too. It has societal costs, real societal costs, and we need to stop it. Every child should have the right, every person should have the right to pick and choose when they choose to be sexually active, not by a trusted adult, because ultimately it's emotional murder. So thank you for having me, and I'll pass the mic.
Hi, thank you. I'm Terry Boyer. I direct the Institute for Women's Leadership here at Villanova. I'm not a lawyer, thank you. But I think for me, one of the most interesting parts about the Me Too movement, and even listening to Ms. Boyce's story, is not so much the evil that was done by the individual perpetrator, but more so what happened in the system surrounding her story. When I think about movements like Me Too and the sorts of description you describe of hundreds and hundreds of people that have come forward, you understand that the cases of sexual harassment and child abuse that are occurring within our systems. And just the sheer number that have come forth in just the past year with regards to Me Too, despite the fact that it was started decades ago, as you laid out at the very beginning, is that it's not about an individual's behavior. It's about what our systems and our culture are allowing to happen. And when we create a situation like within athletics, elite athletics in particular, our schools, any place where you have that level of power differential and extreme trust that is placed, perpetrators will find that place to go in and find a place where they are protected. And it really is painful for individuals to think that a system that you trusted is one which is actually harming you, which is why I think in your story, talking about Kathy's role is what is so much more doubly painful, right? Because you have a system that we as a culture are supposed to be trusting and we think is going to help us, and that makes us actually more vulnerable and victimizes us in a lot of ways. So for me, as a person who's been engaged in gender equity issues for decades now, to see what's happening with Me Too isn't that this hasn't been going on for a while. It's that the sheer numbers of people who have felt that they can follow Ms. Boyce and say, Me Too, and that we can then use that to finally change our system and hold people accountable within the system is what's inspiring to me. It's not shocking to me what's occurring. What's exciting for me about this is that maybe this will be leading to real change.
Well, the question I think was about accountability, and for us, that's really in our DNA. My boss, Dwayne Bray, likes to talk about accountability journalism, and that's usually the first thing that comes to his lips when he discusses, what Outside the Lines is all about. So for us, this story started with a trickle. I was doing a story about hazing in the summer of 2016, working with another attorney at John's firm, and it was because of my connection, and I didn't really know John very well, but we'd met a couple times, and it was because of my connection with his firm that they shot me a press release in late summer of 2016 of a Jane Doe who was bringing suit against USA Gymnastics. Well, we now know that Jane Doe was Jamie Dancher, the very first Olympian to sue, and she made some very inflammatory allegations about Bella and Marta Crowley and the culture down at the Crowley Ranch in Texas, and echoed comments that another Olympian, Dominique Moceanu, had made years before. But it was really rare for gymnasts of that stature, national team gymnasts, Olympians, to come out and criticize the machine that produced these women who represent us every 4 years. Bella and Marta Crowley lorded over the gymnastics program and ruled with an iron fist and brought a real Eastern Bloc mentality to how they coached these young girls. And that was part of the problem that allowed Larry Nassar to flourish. From us, so we initially just knew about that one case, but we didn't report it. The Indianapolis Star did, and they got it first. And to their credit, they had built on the Indianapolis Star. For those of you who aren't aware, did a wonderful series of articles in the summer of 2016 about pedophile coaches in the gymnastics community and how they were basically, how communities, how parents were not informed when pedophiles were shuffled from one gym to the next, much in the way that priests were shuffled from one parish to the next. And they then did the story about Jamie Dancher and Rachel Van Hollander, who was the first to come forward. And at that point, it really wasn't a Michigan State story because, Rachel, other than the fact that Larry Nassar was an osteopathic physician at Michigan State, for us, there really wasn't enough of a connection for it to be all about Michigan State. But then all of a sudden, Larissa Boyce came forward. And Tiffany Thomas Lopez, a former softball player who's a client of John's, came forward. And I went to my bosses and I said, look, these lawyers are telling me there could be dozens, maybe hundreds of women. Why don't we really try to hone in on women who told? Not tried to tell, did tell. So Larissa told in 1997. She mentioned another young lady who remains a Jane Doe, it was very important for us, in the room when Larissa told her coach and said, the same thing happened to me. So now we've got 2 women from that 1997 meeting. We've got a softball player. Ultimately we had 4 women in a story that we did for Outside the Lines, and we had them months before the story ran, and it was driving me nuts because I kept going to my bosses and saying, why are you not running the story? I wanted them to run the story, but they kept making me wait. And ultimately, they made us wait until right around the time of the very first criminal sexual conduct trial for Larry Nassar, when that remarkable parade of courageous women came forward. And I think our story actually had more impact because of that. But the reporter who wants to get the story out there in me, I felt crushed that we didn't run it even earlier. But the remarkable thing about that week for me was, if you just look at the arc of this story and when change really started to happen, it really wasn't until those women got up in court and started to speak that change happened at lightning speed. All of a sudden, the president out, the board of USA Gymnastics gone, the athletic director gone. It took women like Larissa Boyce getting up in court and giving that gut-wrenching testimony for there really to be true accountability. And you want to talk about the power of the Me Too movement. I don't know of a better example of it than what we saw in those 2 criminal proceedings. And the other thing I would just say, and I think this might be a valuable thing to take away for would-be attorneys, I know it was very instructive for me, is just the importance of meeting these women where they want to be met. The other young woman who corroborated Larissa's story and who was a source for our story, she initially wanted to do the interview at her attorney's office, not this attorney, another attorney. And, just from a visual standpoint, we thought that would look horrible. We hate shooting in conference rooms because they always look sterile. We wanted it to sort of have a homier setting. She didn't want to do it at her house, so I rented a suite. And I wasn't listening to what this lady was telling me. She really wanted the comfort of just being in her attorney's office, and there was a woman in the attorney's office who could hold her baby, and I was blowing past all of these signals. So we set up this interview for her to come speak with us at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in some hotel suite in Lansing, and she didn't show up. And I thought, we blew it. She's never going to show up. But it was it was instructive for me. And I apologized profusely. I said, listen, I'm so sorry for not listening to your concerns. Eventually, she wound up doing the interview at her lawyer's office. And, just those trivial little things that enter your mind about how we were concerned about something so trivial as the background, when really what we really should have focused on is her needs, her concerns. And so I would just encourage you to really listen and meet these people where they want to be met.
So good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I think this is such an important topic, and I just applaud all of your kind of candor in discussing it. One of the things I'd like to bridge to and to take away from some of the themes of each of your first answers is really that we are in a moment of accountability and of looking at things that are about individuals and having people lose jobs or go to jail or do things. But I am intensely passionate about how cultures learn from these moments in time to get to a phase 4, right? So that it's not about holding someone accountable for the bad thing that happened, but preventing it in the first place and really having a culture of safety. And the safe to speak up culture isn't safe to speak up after something bad happened, but the safe to speak up so that it doesn't happen in the first place. And then if you catch a wind that somebody's doing something that's inappropriate or people are uncomfortable, that people honestly tackle and wrestle with those types of questions. So with the developments over the past year, what do you think you've learned individually, or what would you like to see places and people do differently to try to get to that better level of protection for children and women and young men who are involved in, sports and other cultures where there's going to remain power gaps for as long as there are big coaches and big teams? I don't know, do you want to start?
Yeah, John kind of touched on this earlier. If we are of the mind that because of the Me Too movement, large institutions have just gone through this sea change, and the culture is now suddenly a putting victims first mentality, we'd be dead wrong.
Yeah. And I'm not there, so I think
I know you're not suggesting that we are there, but sadly, it's going to take courageous women like Larissa, aggressive attorneys like John, to hold institutions accountable. The media obviously plays a role as well. But we're in the not too distant past, I worked on another story about a young lady who was sexually involved with her coach at the University of Arizona. She says he coerced and intimidated her into meeting him for sex. When she tried to break it off, he grabbed her by the throat and put a box cutter to her face and threatened to cut her face up so no man would ever want her. He admitted it on tape to the police. We had his admission. He then made a series of death threats in 57 unbelievable emails on his university email, by the way, which we were able to get through a public records request, and also left her, she recorded a threatening phone call. This guy stayed out for 3 years. This guy, his civil attorney is being paid by the state of Arizona to the tune of about $1 million. So, where's the protection for her? She was in fear for 3 years. Just late last month, they finally convicted the guy of assault. This should have been a slam dunk. I mean, the guy admitted it on tape. And you know what the University of Arizona did in that case to investigate? They brought the coach in and said, "Are you sexually involved with this athlete?" "No, nothing more to see here." They sent her a couple of emails. No one ever even talked to her. Her Title IX rights were steamrolled. And, just last week, a colleague of mine broke a story about at Michigan State University, a young woman who alleges she was gang raped by 3 basketball players. When she reported it, they did everything but try to talk her out of it because they were ball players. So it's disgusting to me that this happens. And the only thing we can do is shine a light on it, shame them, sue them if you're an attorney or somebody who's a survivor, and hopefully that leads to some level of accountability where they will be reluctant to do the wrong thing and they will choose the right thing next time.
It seems that, I think, on some college campuses, right, you've seen with sexual assault cases and reports about sexual assault cases where there's at least been some effort to have a more cultural pressure among students that it's not going to happen here, right? And so I guess, do you think that we need more years of panels about accountability and Me Too and getting that right before we get to protection and prevention? How hopeful are you, I guess? Doesn't seem like it.
how hopeful are you?
You-
I mean,
you-
John,
let me-
this is your world. I mean, you work these cases full time. How
Yeah,
hopeful are you?
So, we're here at Villanova, whose team won the national championship, by the way, congratulations. And that's great. It's basketball. But I cannot tell you the number of schools who look at the victim as the adversary from the get-go. If you accuse a Michigan State basketball player and two of his teammates of sexually assaulting you, you're not an adversary. You're just somebody who's a victim of a crime. In so many institutions, Title IX departments are completely disconnected from the values of the university. Universities traditionally are places of progressive thought, higher learning, truth. I think 2/3, I don't know what your university symbol looks like, but there's a good chance it has Veritas in it.
Right there, yep.
All right.
First one.
Okay, that was a lie. I saw it. But I'm a trial lawyer. What do you want? But Veritas means truth. And so much of that, in my experience, is lost when somebody comes forward because immediately the institution goes into us versus them in liability mode. And look, is there a risk of liability? Sure. But what I can tell you is, what most survivors want is somebody to say, you didn't do anything wrong, I'm sorry. We may not, as an institution, we may not have done anything wrong, but when you go into cover-up mode and adversary mode, you make the case, not only, you make the damage to the victim exponentially worse. And you make the stupid thing from a legal standpoint is the lawyers who do that make the case against the university worse. So, there's an insurance company called United Educators, which is actually insures, and it actually is owned by most of the universities in the United States, I think 1,300 schools. And I've looked at their Michigan State's insurer, and I've looked at their Title IX training and how they view it, and they say, whatever you do, their advice is whatever you do to these universities, don't have a victim-centric environment. What? What kind of advice is that? You know what advice that is? That's dumb. What you should do in the case of sexual assault is be fair, be equitable, give people a hearing. You don't have to believe everybody just because they say it. But to treat every survivor as an adversary, which frankly is what most Title IX departments do, is a prescription for disaster. And in my view, somebody said once that institutions are fragile and frequently don't know it. Michigan State University has descended into the public relations abyss. It is exponentially worse than Penn State. It is regarded by its alumni. MasterCard just pulled a $45 million scholarship program for them. You couldn't handle this any worse than they have. And it can happen to any institution that handles it that way. And this problem is not going away, and in my view, universities need to, and other institutions really need to take a close look at how they handle these cases and stop looking at somebody who's actually assaulted as your adversary.
I just want to, if John talked about where the Title IX and the university compliance officers are in terms of their response, I want to focus on the individual at each of these organizations, which is perhaps the first person that you're going to go to and tell your story. We all, in order to work here at Villanova and at many other institutions, have to go through a clearances process, and you have to say, okay, I'm a mandatory reporter, right? But I think most people, when they do that, say, okay, it's just a box I need to check, and I understand that, and I'm done, and I'm not. But we don't actually think about what responsibility is there. And this is for individuals. I'm not talking about people who are in compliance offices or others. I'm talking about the responsibility of every one of us as members of this system that's perpetrating everything that's going on and allowing what's happening in these situations. And I think that, okay, it's great from a systemic, at that upper level of the institution to talk about that, but we need to get to that point where if, as John said, you don't believe right off the bat, but at least everybody is given a chance to be heard and listened to, and then falls into the system where the university is responsive in a way that they need to be, or if it's not a university, where the organization or the athletic conference or whatever is responsive in the way they need to be. But it can't just start at that level. It has to start with the individuals who are going to sit and say, okay, I'm going to listen to you and believe you if needed, or at least follow the procedures that I'm supposed to follow, and not just write that off. I mean, we don't tend to think of our individual responsibility within these organizations to uphold that system.
I think it has to start with educating your employees, educating everybody at the schools on how to handle reports of sexual abuse. And the training should not just be a PowerPoint that you can click and check and 10 minutes you're done. I truly believe it needs to be something where people have to hear from actual victims and hear how it has affected their lives and how it could have been handled differently had somebody believed them. You know, had Kathy believed me and handled it the right way, and even told my parents. You know, I believe it starts with education. And like you guys were saying, MSU can write a book on what not to do. I mean, they have been basically at war with all of the victims. So it seems like every day we're getting re-blamed and shamed and re-victimized because of their callous response to sexual abuse. They put a price tag on our heads instead of look at us like we're human beings.
I had an interaction with a media relations person from Michigan State when I ultimately went to them for a comment about the story we were getting ready to run, which included the interview with Larissa and 3 other women who told in the late 90s about their abuse at the hands of Larry Nassar. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said words to the effect of, are all of these women involved in litigation? So are you going to make sure you make that point, John, that all of these women are involved in civil litigation trying to get a large settlement from Michigan State University? That's your starting point? You know, right? We're talking about a story that's going to hold your institution accountable for what it did not do to stop the man who could very well go down as the largest pedophile in the history of U.S. sport, and that's your starting point? You know, it's just sort of that bunker mentality. And I read something interesting this past week about the number of administrators at Michigan State who came up through Michigan State, leading to even a more insular culture. Luana K. Simon, who is the ousted president, who, by the way, got a heck of a golden parachute, and now she's got a really cushy office back on campus. Really? I mean, what are the optics of that? You know, she could have still remained part of the Spartan community without that. She could have still been financially made whole without that. So there's just so many things that you hear in your interactions with people. Paula Levine is a reporter that works with me who's my hero. She basically led the charge at Baylor that led to Ken Starr getting fired as president, or having to step down as president, I should say, and Art Briles being fired as the head coach. She's done great work at Michigan State, exposing a number of cases where young women have been sexually assaulted by athletes, and the response by the athletic department and just the almost reflexive reaction to protect, bunker, throw up walls, prevent us from getting information. I was told by a former human resources person at Michigan State that they basically have 3 files. They have the file that they give the media that's sanitized. They have the file that they give their general counsel, and then they have the file that they'll give opposing counsel. It should only be 1 file, right? I mean, we asked for the personnel file for Dean William Strample, who is the head of the School of Osteopathic Medicine, the guy who we now know had a history, according to allegations, of making sexually inappropriate comments in the office. He's accused of groping women. This is the guy who, when Larry Nassar was under a police investigation, didn't think to follow up and see if he was, when a student came forward in 2014 and there was a police investigation and a Title IX investigation, they laid down very specific protocols for what he was supposed to do moving forward. He was to have no skin-to-skin contact with his patients. He was to have a chaperone in the room. He didn't do any of that. And nobody ever checked to see if he was doing it. The guy was under police investigation. Nobody thought to follow up. Well, who's his boss? His boss is a guy who's now charged with crimes of his own. So, I don't know. There's just, it's not a very hopeful picture. And I wish I could provide a more hopeful picture, but we just see example after example of large institutions not displaying that there's been a significant change in the culture. And I don't know what it's going to take to get there, but we got to do something.
So I guess I was thinking during the prior panel about how cultural change is difficult. It's difficult when you're in the moment. It's difficult if you're the person bringing it about. And it's difficult sometimes to see ahead. I guess I was also thinking, Terry, about your comment about individuals. And to me, I think part of the failings that you've so aptly identified, some of them are at the top, but some of them are down here, right? Some of this is like, if you know that he's not supposed to be in a room with somebody by himself, go in, right? And it's not to say that you shouldn't then be held accountable if you were the doctor who brought that about and you shouldn't have been doing it. But some of this comes down to a little bit of, I think, holding ourselves to standards that we want to live with. And if the conduct that you've described, right, is appalling. Nobody wants to live in that world, and it's clearly criminal conduct. I think there's also a lot of other Me Too related conduct that sometimes gets treated like it's in this gray area, except if you're in the room. And then maybe if you're in the room, the accountability can start a little bit earlier than leaving it, in my mind, to the victim to have to go for it, to go through an interview process, I guess. And maybe I'm being too optimistic about it, but
Look, I think what you're talking about is moral courage.
Yes.
And saying,
Right.
You're not doing that. What you're doing is wrong,
Yes.
stop it. I'm going to call the police. In this case,
No.
14 women
Yes.
that didn't know each other
Right.
reported in different circumstances. USA Gymnastics, to give you an idea of the perniciousness of what they did, knew in June of 2015 that he had molested Allie Raisman, Michaela Maroney, and Maggie Nichols, all of whom are my clients. They knew. Michaela told them that he assaulted her on a table and was on top of her naked, thrusting with his hand in her vagina. They told them that. They told the FBI that. The first time they interviewed Allie Raisman was over a year later. The FBI. They knew, USA Gymnastics and the USOC, the president of the USOC, knew in July of 2015 that Larry Nassar had sexually assaulted gold medalists when they were children. They never called Michigan State and told them. I can tell you at this point, we know of 60 little girls, and it's probably in the hundreds, that he assaulted after that date.
And similarly, John, in 2014, when he was under Title IX investigation at Michigan State and police investigation, Michigan State never said, hey, by the way, you're Olympic doctor.
What I was going to say is, had USA Gymnastics called, what they would have immediately learned is he was under an active police investigation by the Michigan State University Police at that time. You want to make cultural, I can tell you, and I recognize I'm at a Catholic university, The bishops didn't begin to change when they had to pay money. They paid billions. The bishops began to change and the religious orders began to change when bishops started going to jail. And if you want cultural change at an institution that's got the kind of culture that the USOC, that USA Gymnastics and Michigan State and many others have, start putting administrators who allow that to happen in prison, in my opinion. Because that sends a message to them, but it also sends a message to those who would engage in that conduct. If you do it, you're going to be punished. Steve Penny, the president of USA Gymnastics, who presided over this obscenity, not only Larry Nassar, but 54 coaches credibly accused of child molestation. That's what the Indy Star disclosed. He resigned in February, March, right before a Senate hearing, and he got $1 million payout. Luana Simon, same thing. What message are you sending that you can allow 100 or 300, 400 little girls to be raped, and you get a 7-figure number? That's not going to change the culture. That just reinforces the behavior.
No, but so I guess thinking of the one thing we wouldn't want to lose is the opportunity to learn from, the opportunity to learn from all of this. So if we have a room full of people who are involved in sports and who are involved in universities and want to make sure that they never let the next person have this happen to them, or the next 100 people have something like this happen to them, I mean, I think you've already shared a number of the things that you would change, having a more victim-centric culture and taking reports differently so that people are trained to do that. You know, I guess, are there more things that you want this audience to think about so that if this ends up in their lap, or it's the first report, that they're really getting it right and not going to end up, you know, being sued by you, right?
I mean, first of all, I think some of it's teammates saying, don't do that.
Yeah.
That's wrong. Yeah, I mean, we've seen some of that already. But also, just telling people that, you know, and when we train young people to say, you know, you are very fortunate to be here. And part of your job as somebody who's, you know, got a brain and got the gift of education is to use that to protect and help other people. I think Kristen Gillibrand said, if you're not helping people, what the fuck are you doing? I like that quote. I mean, that's the bottom line. If one person had looked at that child and the 300 children as a human being, if one person had looked at Bailey Gibson, the person from Arizona, as a human being, it wouldn't happen. Because in order to do this, in order to ignore this conduct, you're dehumanizing the person. And ultimately, the dehumanization, it's not the sex that's the damage. It's the power control and ultimately the dehumanization of that victim. And, you know, in my opinion, that's what we need to do. It's okay to speak up in the face of this. And if you're wrong and you lose your job, get another one. It'll be okay. And that's hard to do. It is. But it's the right thing to do. And that, you know, that's who we're supposed to be as a people.
And I think, too, that people just need to believe when somebody comes to them with allegations that somebody is abusing them. It's not their job to investigate. Their job is to tell the authorities, the proper authorities, and whether they believe you or not, they just need to do the right, that's the one step that they need to do. You don't have to question the person, you just say, okay, I will file this, and end of discussion. Let the proper authorities handle it. I think that could have been so different had Kathy done that. It would have been so much less traumatizing for me.
That's what always blows my, I'm sorry, Terry, that's what always blows my mind. And, you know, I covered the Penn State story pretty extensively as well. Just think what would have been avoided if they would have just picked up the phone and called the police. You know, forget telling the campus police. What would have happened if Kathy Klages would have just said, hey, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Michelle? Yes, that was your maiden name, Mr. and Mrs. Michelle. Something happened. You know, Larissa told me about something at practice today when she went to see Larry. You know, I just want to make you aware of it. That, you know, just, you start hearing these stories and you think, huh? I mean, I've got a kid who was in daycare when he would fall and get a little bump on his head. They wrote up like a freaking 4-page police report, you know, because he was playing with the blocks and he tripped. This lady was digitally penetrated by a doctor in the basement of the gymnastics practice facility at Michigan State. And another young lady said the same thing happened to her, and the coach didn't even think to tell their parents. You know, I just don't get it. I do not get it. And, you know, what has to change for that to happen? Maybe that coach needs to be criminally charged.
I think, too, that you're right, Erin, in that there's a definite process to systemic change, but it's difficult and it's challenging. And we're at that first step, which is awareness, but we haven't moved yet beyond that. But that's a really powerful and important step in what's going on in this movement. And I want to so I talked about the individual, but I think also there's a critical role that leaders are playing too within these systems. And they have this almost dissonance that they have, right, where one, their responsibility is to protect the institution, but two, they have to make the institution vulnerable and acknowledge these issues in order to move forward. And I think that's where a lot of systems and organizations fail, is that the leadership talks the talk and says, okay, this is our policy, this is what, you know, this is not tolerated, et cetera. But then when it gets to walking that talk, they abandon it because they default to protecting the institution. And that's where there needs to be a consistent push to have that change. And I would be remiss if and my colleagues would, you know, say you didn't take this opportunity, but if you are on campus on Monday, there's an actual brown bag about what you talked about, what to do if a student reports on sexual violence, like what should you do? And it's not done in a checkbox PowerPoint slide perspective. It's a sit down, talk to me, what am I supposed to do? How do I handle that? And inclusive of the perspective of a victim. So there's an opportunity for that, and I think this is one of several that's going on this campus. But
I want to just go back to something John said. I don't even think he did it on purpose, but when he was talking about when you see these situations or you have these individuals, and he said, you can shine a light, shame them, and soothe them. And I don't think he did it on purpose, but he kind of went down the row. Shine a light, shame them, soothe them. And I think I'm going to add in counsel them and teach people to sue them, just so I have a role in that. Then, you know, because it's about me. We only have just a couple minutes left. I want to add, I guess two things have struck me listening to your comments. One is the importance of stories and telling stories, listening to stories. I can only imagine the job you do telling stories in court. And I guess a lot of times the law isn't set up to deal with anecdotes. You know, I see it in class when a student will say, we'll start telling a personal anecdote. I can see this sort of, it's almost the pen dropping. So, but what we're hearing is how important it is. Like nothing changed until we had, not nothing, but all those stories is when the real change started. So I guess that's one comment I'd like to throw out to see if you have anything about. And then also, do you think there's anything the other social movements we talked about can learn from Me Too? Is there anything that Me Too has to offer to take a knee, shut up and dribble, any of those?
Well, I think that number one, with regard to stories, I think that's where the criminal justice system has failed. Because the victim, you know, with the exception of places that have passed Marcy's law, really doesn't have a representative. Prosecutor represents the state, the defendant is represented by a lawyer. And the thing that I like that Judge Aquilina did is she gave them that voice. Now, let me tell you, I'm not people would not say I was a fan of Judge Aquilina. We actually sued her because she issued a gag order on our clients and every client, and we sued her in federal district court for violating their First Amendment rights and won. The court lifted the gag order and she had to modify it. And, you know, was Her Honor dramatic a little bit? Yeah, she was. But what she did with those impact statements was give these women a voice in a way that, you know, when you're assaulted, it's not sanitized. It's violent, it's foul, it's oppressive, and it's horrific. And so many judges require victims to say, you can't use bad language, you have to be respectful in the court. You know, Maddie Larson, who's a national team gymnast, got up and said, I fucking hate you, Larry. Fucking hate you. And should that language be used in a courtroom? Well, maybe not. But you know what? It was restorative for her. And if we're really about justice, victims need to be given that room. I'm not sure about saying I'm signing your death warrant. That may have been a little much, but given the gravity of the harm he had done, he had committed emotional murder on, 300 women. What was the second question? Sorry.
Can other movements learn something from Me Too?
Well, I think Me Too has learned from those who have gone before him. I think the civil rights movement, I think, I think Kyle Stevens said, what was her comment? Little girls grow up and then they destroy you? They come back to destroy you. I mean, I think that was a watershed moment. I was there. It was my privilege to be there. And, I can't tell you how proud I am of these women and girls. Somebody like Allie and Jordan, I mean, do you know what it's hard to imagine what it's like to be a public figure and have to get up and you're an accomplished gold medalist and then describe the most vile, intimate thing that ever happened to you in front of a room full of people and millions of people on television. Because you want to heal, but also you want to help other people. So, I don't know, I think that's the best answer I have.
I think other movements can learn that when you speak up, your voice is being heard, and you have the ability to create the change that you want. I think the more women in our case who spoke up and gave up their Jane Doe, said, no, this happened to me, Larissa Boyce, that made it so much more real. And, I truly think that people need to know that your voice is strong. And especially when you are doing it to help other people, and the more people that can speak up in whatever movement, putting your voices together creates change.
By the way, this is a great argument for cameras in the courtroom, because if we didn't have cameras, maybe we're not here, right? There was a narrative that was being bandied about for many, many months with respect to the Nassar story about how it wasn't resonating like Penn State. And a lot of the women who were involved were, frankly, pretty insulted by that. And, at ESPN, we could kind of explain it away by saying, well, it doesn't involve a legendary coach. It didn't really rise to the president's office, even though the president ultimately was held accountable. When I sat down and started speaking to these women, in late 2016, and going to my bosses and telling them about it, candidly, even at ESPN, I don't know that people were really buying in. But everything changed when those women got up and spoke in court. Everything changed. And it became like must-watch TV. And, not to be trivial and dismiss it like that, it was just so impactful. And, you want to talk about what other movements can learn. It wasn't enough for them to just become this force through this unified voice. They've actually done very practical things in recent months, and then I know John's been a part of it, I know you've been a part of it. They're changing laws, There's a package of bills winding its way through the Michigan State Legislature right now. It passed the Senate. It's right now in front of the House. They're going to strengthen reporting laws in Michigan if it gets passed. They're going to change the laws with respect to the statute of limitations. So these are practical things that can happen. And, you talk about what other movements can learn. I look at Malcolm Jenkins here in Philadelphia, a socially active Eagles player. That's a guy who, it's just not enough to talk the talk. You have to walk it. He's on the front lines. He's going to Congress. He's going to police agencies. He's in the community. So I give a lot of, I in no way judge women who don't get socially involved and politically involved. But that's where change happens, right? And to the extent that many of these women have become agents of change, that's the most impressive part to me.
I don't know if so much the movement, so much as those of us listening to the movement can learn from Me Too, and that's that one of the most powerful pieces that you've heard in the discussion here is that the concept of belief and believing that that happens. And when we're talking about incidences that are really tangible and horrifying, like what we've been discussing here, and you compare it to the sorts of things that Take a Knee is trying to combat, some of those are horrifying, horrible individual incidences, but it's also general bias that leads to and allows those things. So I think that those of us who are listening to Me Too should also be listening to those other movements and thinking and listening for belief. And, like if people are repeatedly saying, this is my experience, this is what's happened to me, and we're not listening, then that's something, again, the onus on the individual to be learning. If your mind was changed by hearing the sheer number of people that can say Me Too, our mind should also be changed by listening to the sheer number of people who say, this is my different experience because of who I am.
I think that's a great place to stop. So let's thank Erin, John, Larissa, John, Terry.
I'm biased, but I think we top it every year. I think this was our best symposium. Thanks to everyone. Is Bridget here? Here she is. This is put on. This is a production of the Morad Sports Journal. Our editor-in-chief, Bridget Wantong.
Hi, everyone. As Andrew said, my name is Bridget Wantong, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Jeffrey S. Morad Sports Law Journal. And before we officially conclude for the day, I just want to first and foremost thank the panelists and thank the moderators for taking the time out of their busy day to come here and share their experience, share their perspective, and share their expertise. And we're truly honored and happy to have you here today. Secondly, I'd like to thank everyone here at Villanova Law for making this possible. It really did take a village, so thank you to Nicole Garofano, Julie Toth, Julie, I'm trying to think now, there is a ton of people that went into this, and also to Joe Mariani and everyone else that was really instrumental in making this happen. All of your efforts were made this possible. Thirdly, I'd like to thank everyone here at the Journal, all the staff writers that helped all the panelists throughout the day, and I'd like to extend a special thank you to Emily Schrank, our managing editor of Symposium Special Projects. Emily, do you want to give a wave? Emily's been my wingwoman throughout this entire process, throughout the year, and has truly been instrumental in making this event such a success. So thank you, Emily. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank Andrew Brandt and Jeffrey Morad for their continued guidance and for their continued support of the journal, and for continuing the tradition of this symposium. It's become such a landmark event here at the law school, and I've been so honored and proud to be a part of it this year. So with that, thank you all for coming. I hope you had a great day at this year's symposium. Thank you again.